Truth Caviar, the show about ideas that matter. Hosted by global thinkers Brent M. Eastwood and Vadim Bichutsky.
Welcome in, everybody. Hope y'all are having a great week. This is the Truth Caviar show. I am Vadim Bichutsky, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Brent M. Eastwood. Today we're talking all about the threat to America and the free world posed by communist China. The rise of China, both as an economic and military power, has probably been the single most important global and geopolitical development since 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. In order to lay the groundwork for America's current predicament as it relates to China and understand where we are and how we got here, we need to review a little bit of history. Following World War II, an on and off again full-scale civil war broke out in the Republic of China, pitting the nationalists against the communists. On October 1st, 1949, after a string of military victories, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. The Nationalist Party and its forces fled to Taiwan. The United States, during the Truman administration, with its Truman Doctrine, opposing the communists, supported the Nationalist Party. After the fall of mainland China to the communists, the Truman administration suspended diplomatic ties with the newly established People's Republic of China. The United States had no diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China until 1972, when Richard Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit the PRC, paving the way for normalizing of diplomatic relations. In 1979, Jimmy Carter formally resumed diplomatic relations with Communist China. By the mid-1980s, China's leader, Deng Xiaoping, appeared to be moving past Mao's isolationist prison state toward the community of modern democratic nations and away from conflict with the West. In response, American companies like Coca-Cola, KFC, and Procter & Gamble were beginning to plant roots in China, and Chinese exports to the United States were growing. At this point, Chinese exports offered no cause for alarm. As long as that process of democratic and economic liberalization continued, America was right to respond with further engagement. However, that liberalization process ended abruptly in 1989 with a parade of tanks amid brutal repression and murder of democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square. The U.S. responded to the Tiananmen Square massacre by banning military sales and freezing relations with China. And since Tiananmen, a ruthless and reactionary CCP has used any means necessary to remain firmly in power. Then, in 1994, Bill Clinton decided to decouple human rights from trade. And in 2000, he signed the U.S.-China Relations Act, granting permanent normal trade relations with China, removing the stipulation that required annual reviews of the country's trade status, and paving the way for China to enter the World Trade Organization in 2001. Here are a few quotes from Bill Clinton in 2000, when he was persuading Congress to pass permanent normal trade relations with China. Quote, "A vote against permanent normal trade relations will cost America jobs as our competitors in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere capture Chinese markets that we otherwise would have served. Supporting China's entry into the WTO, however, is about more than our economic interests. It is clearly in our larger national interest It represents the most significant opportunity that we have had to create positive change in China since the 1970s, when President Nixon first went there, and later in the decade when President Carter normalized relations. I am working as hard as I can to convince Congress and the American people to seize this opportunity. The WTO agreement will move China in the right direction. It will advance the goals America has worked for in China for the past 3 decades. And of course, it will advance our own economic interests. Economically, this agreement is the equivalent of a one-way street. It requires China to open its markets. With a fifth of the world's population, potentially the biggest market in the world, to both our products and services in unprecedented new ways. All we do is to agree to maintain the present access which China enjoys. For the first time, our companies will be able to sell and distribute products in China made by workers here in America without being forced to relocate manufacturing to China, sell through the Chinese government, or transfer valuable technology for the first time. We'll be able to export products without exporting jobs. If you believe in a future of greater prosperity for the American people, you certainly should be for this agreement. He could not have been more wrong.
Thank you, Vadim. And Vadim is going to take care of domestic policy and trade policy for China today. And I'm going to talk about foreign policy and national security strategy in China and the underpinnings of this type of thinking. So the foreign policy and national security strategy in China has been taken over these days by the populists, nationalists, and hardliners. These folks are called the Yingpai, which means hawks or eagles. And these guys have the ear of Xi Jinping. These people are usually current and former generals and admirals. So these are leadership of the military, and they have become the real voice of China. The narrative is that the United States is declining and that China is rising. The idea is that many Americans do not know that China is waging an intense struggle against the United States at any given time. The idea is for China to hide in plain sight and engineer a rise in power without Americans knowing what is going on. And many Americans do not realize that the United States has fought in combat against Chinese troops. This was during the Korean War. 30,000 American troops died, some at the hands of Chinese communist soldiers. They came in human wave attacks, and it was a bloodbath. So some Americans still, however, adhere to the adage that the West should help China and assist them for better relations and diplomacy. And this is called constructive engagement that Bill Clinton entered into. Over the previous decades, this was what drove American policy with China since Kissinger and Nixon's made that entree into the country. The belief that there could be a peaceful rise and that someday China would become more democratic, so ordinary Chinese could get better civil rights. That's what we believed. We thought that more diplomacy and trade with China would create more democratic opportunities for their government. And we gave them technology and military assistance during the 70s and for some years during the 80s. And this was all under constructive engagement. This is the idea that you work with China and be kind to China and they would become more democratic. So the United States made many false assumptions. First, that constructive engagement would bring about complete cooperation with the Chinese. And with trade and technology assistance, it was assumed that China would eventually agree with the U.S. and the West on a peaceful regional and world order. China does not have those agreements now in their foreign policy. China is not helping the West and the United States to stop North Korea and Iran's nuclear programs, not cooperating on fighting global terrorism. Also, there is this assumption, which I have said before, that China is on the road to democracy. That could not be further from the truth. Cooperation with the United States and the West would lead to democratic change in China? Check out Tiananmen Square. It hasn't led to democratic change in China. It was thought that China would evolve into a liberal democracy. Slowly but surely, we've seen a backup. we've seen a movement away from democracy. We also have found out that China hates dissent and protest in Hong Kong and other areas, and political opposition to communism. They're very worried about opposition and protest movements against communism.
So since 2001, when China entered WTO, they have become actually more totalitarian. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement. And
so here's a quote from Bao Qing-tang, who was a Tiananmen Square protester, and he was jailed, I believe. Now he lives in New York City.
Right.
Quote, more than 2 decades after Tiananmen, the totalitarian tiger has still not changed its stripes. In fact, unlike more stable countries, China's spending on police and social control is now rising even faster than China's skyrocketing defense budget.
Yes. And along with that, thank you for that quote, there is authoritarian capitalism. So we thought that as China opened up its global markets with the WTO and started instituting reforms and special economic zones to grow a capitalist-facing economy, that in tandem with those types of reforms, you would have democratic reforms too.
Bill Clinton and others, they believed that by opening markets to the Chinese, their government would become more liberal.
Correct.
So thinking of it logically, if you have a totalitarian government, what's its main objective? It's not to help their people, it's to remain in power.
Stay in power.
So if you give a totalitarian regime more money, which is what we did, is it more or less likely that they would give up some of their power? I would argue that what Bill Clinton, and that's not just Bill Clinton, Republicans in Congress and others, that was a completely wrong-headed approach. It's easy in hindsight to say that, but you don't reward a totalitarian regime. You have to have leverage over them. If that leverage is gone, in other words, the growth of its economy, then what incentive do they have to give up more power? If you make a totalitarian regime richer, it will become even more totalitarian. If you give a tiger more food, it will want more food.
We were overconfident and we mischaracterized the Chinese regime. And we thought that that would be like the winning of the Cold War, that when the Soviet Union broke up, that we defeated communism with democratic capitalism. There would be a new world order, and that right. China, there would be regime change in China someday, that the democratic powers would elect a Republican form of government and leaders of political parties, multiple parties, and freedom of the press, and so forth. We were naive.
Right.
We thought this could happen in China, and the Chinese were way ahead of us.
We took a completely opposite approach to China that we took with the Soviet Union. We isolated it economically. We didn't do business with the Soviet Union. We took a completely different approach with China, and we've paid for it.
Yes, Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious. So he started talking about opening up the economy very early. And we probably should have not taken that at face value and worried more about democratic approaches to dealing with China and changing the democratic processes through which they tried to keep their people in check and so forth. But we were naive. We didn't realize that along with capitalistic reforms, there would not be democratic reforms. China has authoritarian capitalism.
Yes.
They're still totalitarian with the Communist Party, even though they allow people to, for the most part, start their own businesses in a limited fashion.
But it's not like you have full control of that business. The government tells you what to do, basically.
Yeah, the Communist Party chief in whatever area you're...
It's not democratic capitalism, it's state capitalism. It's really fascist. When the state tells the private sector what to do, when the state controls the private sector, that's fascism. Essentially, they morphed from like pure communist regime to a fascist regime.
Yeah, it's a fascist dictatorship, even though there are elements of capitalist tendencies. So this has been called authoritarian resilience. It stays. It grows. You still have a totalitarian resilience and authoritarian resilience. And then you have these sham elections. There's no freedom of assembly, no ads or campaign posters, no criticism of the party, no debates. Violating these rules are considered crimes.
Chinese version of state capitalism, in my view, it's no different from Germany under Hitler.
Yeah, in Germany under Hitler, you had major corporations still like Krupps and Siemens that were producing goods and services.
Ostensibly, you had a private sector under Hitler.
You did. It was limited. It was some were nationalized, but you still had the various corporations that were pledged their loyalty to Hitler, but they still operated under a profit and loss and trying to make money.
Right, but they didn't dare to go against what Hitler told them to do.
Correct. Well, another assumption that we've had over the years with China is that China has instituted a way to really deceive us. And they do this by a strategy called the fragile flower. They make us think that they're non-threatening, that they're not a threat. And this means that China would tell foreign governments, hey, we're having all kinds of problems. We have pollution and corruption. There's not going to be democratic reform, even though we want to. The government could collapse at any time.
They're a wolf in sheep's clothing.
They're pulling the wool over our eyes, and they're trying to becoming, we're fragile, we're not a threat. And meanwhile, while they do that, they are doing a rise. So the idea was for other countries to think that China was weak. But really, China's leaders were deceiving the West, and at the same time, China was building up its economy and its military. So the fragile flower ruse was a way to deceive the West and other countries in East Asia.
Just to go back to allowing China into the WTO, the business community lobbied hard for that, the corporation, because they wanted a new market.
New markets, I would say so. I'd say some of them. There was a pushback from Ross Perot and others and Pat Buchanan, who
Populists,
were populists and paleo-conservatives, you could call them, that said, hey, if you do this, we're going to lose a lot of jobs, just like NAFTA. Right. A lot of jobs would go to Mexico. But for the most part, everybody bought into the democratic capitalism that there would be reforms if you opened up the economy with the Chinese and trade. Yeah. The rising tide leads to all boats, rising boats with the rising tide. That was the thinking. And that also that if China became a democracy, democracies were believed to not fight each other. Right. So this would lead to democratic peace.
To a more peaceful world.
Yeah, democratic peace theory. So if China became more democratic, it would be less likely to threaten its neighbors and threaten the United States.
Right.
Well, we also messed up because we thought culturally that the Chinese are very similar to us and have the same goals and the same wants and needs. This is not true.
The idea was that basically the Chinese would be ingrained in American culture, American products, and they would be smitten by it, and they'll want to become just like America.
And the ordinary Chinese would be smitten by new democratic ideas and democratic culture and products like Levi's jeans and right. music and movies. If they used our products and they watched our movies, we would beat them in the culture war of ideas, kind of like we beat the Soviets with the same types of ideas.
They might even try to overthrow the communist regime.
Could be regime change.
Interesting.
So they're not really like us. They tend to be less direct. We tend to be more upfront with the way we communicate. Not always, but these are generalizations. But
right.
They tend to be less direct and less transparent.
And less openly combative.
And less individualistic and more communitarian. They
right.
believe in sticking together and rising up as a nation rather than individual rights. There's really no history or culture of the belief in individual rights and democracy. That is kind of a foreign thing that we assumed they would be just like us.
Less argumentative.
Go with what the state says. Go with what my boss says. Top down, authoritarian.
Right. We should have known that because we've dealt with Japan, and Japan, I think, has a similar culture.
Yeah, that could be argued.
In certain respects. So
that's a good point. I haven't thought about that. But we did make mistakes, and we we didn't foresee China having this overall strategy of deception. And this goes back to the warring times when there are various dynasties fighting each other. And the Chinese were a very warlike people in the past. And they have a history of war. But on the other hand, they had this idea of a peaceful rise and that they could pull the wool over our eyes.
Right.
This strategy of deception. And they're heroes, they're cultural heroes in literature, film, and TV programs, often have the heroes that bide their time, wait strategically, deceive the enemy, hide their intentions, and then they win at the end.
The art of war.
Yeah, Sun Tzu.
Yeah, Sun Tzu, right. So let's talk about China's 8 unfair trade practices.
Oh, yeah, let's hear those.
So in his book, Death by China, Peter Navarro lists 8 weapons of job destruction, which China uses to destroy American jobs. Let me just read all 8 of them and then we can discuss it. 1, an elaborate web of illegal export subsidies. 2, a cleverly manipulated and grossly undervalued currency. 3, the blatant counterfeiting, piracy, and outright theft of America's intellectual property treasures. 4, an incredibly short-sighted willingness by the Chinese Communist Party to trade massive environmental damage for a few more pennies of production cost advantage. 5, ultra-lax worker health and safety standards, so far below international norms that they make brown lung, butchered limbs, and a dizzying array of cancers, not just occupational hazards, but virtual certainties. 6, unlawful tariffs, quotas, and other export restrictions on key raw materials from antimony to zinc as a strategic ploy to gain greater control over the world's metallurgy and heavy industry. 7, predatory pricing and dumping practices designed to push foreign rivals out of key resource markets and then gouge consumers with monopoly pricing. 8, China's wanted great walls of protectionism to keep all foreign competitors from setting up shop on Chinese soil. So let's talk about illegal export practices. What does that entail and how does China do that? To jumpstart your enterprise, the Chinese government will provide you with free land, subsidized energy, and almost unlimited access to low or no interest loans. And if you get into trouble, you won't have to pay back the loans, as the government owns and controls all the banks, and the Communist Party appoints all the bank's executives. Once you're ready to export your product to America, you will get a nice, juicy direct subsidy for every item you sell, on the order of 10 to 20 cents for every dollar shipped. In addition, when the profits start rolling in, you'll be eligible for some hefty income and property tax breaks. On top of all this, your Chinese enterprise need never worry that an American competitor will attack you in your own backyard. If foreigners want to sell into your market, they will be forced to set up shop on Chinese soil and become your minority partner. So China plays these games in violation of World Trade Organization rules. So my question is, why is that not enforced? If you are a member of the WTO, there are rules that you have to follow to make sure that you trade fairly with other nations. Why is that not enforced?
Well, the WTO assumes that everybody plays by the rules. So there are rules to protect workers and protect capitalist practices, but it's not enforced.
Okay.
And so they make the assumption that China would not do anything like that. They play by the same rules as the West and other democratic capitalists. But over the years, China has found out that these practices have really helped them and helped them grow. They don't think they're breaking the rules.
But they're illegal.
They don't think they're breaking the rules. And
do you really think they legitimately believe that they're not breaking the rules?
Yeah, I think culturally they think this is the way to do capitalism.
Really?
I think that's the way they think it should be done.
Before they joined WTO, they promised to play by the rules.
Sure, they promised, but this is the strategy of deception. This is pulling the wool over your opponent's eyes. This is doing incremental things over a long time period, over the last 20, 22 years since WTO. And they're nationalists. They believe in using every power possible to increase economic growth and create jobs for their citizens. And remember, they're worried about domestic unrest. So they know that if they have urbanization, they have more people moving from the countryside where they were making less than $2 a day to better wages in the cities. If they're working and making money and they're employed and they have housing and healthcare, that they're not going to rise up against the government and overthrow anybody. So this economic policy is one way domestically that they can keep the country in control. And by what you were saying, the way they use economic policy as a means for political power and to keep people from getting their own individualized political power is amazing what the Chinese do.
That would be like me and you playing basketball with me being in handcuffs.
Yeah,
or calling it fair.
And right? Then, like, if I call a foul, or if you call a foul against me, nobody does anything.
Right. What the hell is it WTO then? What is its purpose? Why does it exist?
It grew from the GATT negotiations. The idea is to level the playing field and take away unfair trade practices like tariffs, to negotiate instead of putting on a tariff, to not do non-trade barriers like dumping and currency manipulation. It was all designed kind of like a United Nations thing where everybody had an equal vote and that you could file a complaint, a WTO complaint. What we found that the complaints went through the bureaucracy very slowly, and China was able to just keep doing what they usually did, which is to do everything to create more national economic growth at all costs.
Right. Why are we putting up with this? Why is America putting up with this?
This is the assumption that the Chinese would grow economically and they would become more democratic. This is the idea that they are just like us, that they would do democratic change, that China would not try to cheat on the WTO, that they would not play weak and loose and fast with the rules, but they did. And the assumption that China is on the road to democracy through economic growth was wrong. We were naive to believe this, and they had no view. You got to understand, this is a culture that believes in the Communist Party that is overrule anything. So they don't believe in giving up sovereignty. Right. The WTO and other trade organizations and international organizations, they're not globalists. So they have a prickly sense of sovereignty at all times. They do not view giving up their sovereignty to multilateral organizations. They're not European Union people. They don't believe in that. They don't believe in giving up power. And so this is why that drove them to break the rules with the WTO, and the WTO is just ineffective.
Interesting. The continued existence of China's elaborate web of illegal export subsidies represents one of the biggest broken promises in world economic history. That's because when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it promised to promptly eliminate all illegal subsidies, along with all other forms of unfair trade practices.
They pick areas of the economy that they want to grow. They're economic nationalists. And then they steal too. They use espionage and intelligence agencies to steal ideas and intellectual property. They pirate and counterfeit goods, as Vadim said earlier. And so they are doing everything they can. And we just don't do that. Culturally, it is not considered something that you do against a trade partner. So it took certain politicians to learn over the years that China was really fleecing us. And so Donald Trump was rising because of this, because of course, we lost jobs. America believes in protecting its workers and letting them unionize and giving them a fair wage and other types of benefits like healthcare, a 5-day work week. There's nothing like that in China. There are no trade unions that improve the lot of the workers.
There's no mental health days.
Yeah, you can't you can't work from home. You're going to stand, there's going to be young people that are working. You're going to stand at the factory floor for hours on end.
Somebody just told me the other day that their company, their weekend starts on Friday at 2 p.m. No work is expected to be done after 2 p.m. on Friday. The way they sell it is like it gives you time to prepare for the weekend. There's no such thing as China.
There's no such thing as a weekend. That's right.
So let's talk about the Chinese currency manipulation, because I think this is another big one that China uses to do damage to American jobs and manufacturing base. China devalues its currency. In practical terms, this means that for every $1 of product that China sells into the United States, Chinese exporters only have to charge the equivalent of 60 cents. That's a huge subsidy. At the same time, for every $1 of product that an American business tries to sell in China, it has to charge the equivalent of considerably more than $1. On top of that indirect tariff, an American manufacturer exporting to China gets slapped with an additional and very direct 30% tariff. So China's currency manipulation acts as both a subsidy and a tariff. So China devalues its currency yuan relative to the dollar. So that means what? That means that Chinese exports in America are cheaper to us, while American imports in China are more expensive. They don't let the yuan to float on financial markets. So I have a question then. Do you have any idea how that works? So they just say, okay, this is what the rate is. That's how China sets it? Or how do they actually, in practical terms, how do they manipulate the currency?
Well, just like what you said, is with subsidies and money printing and so forth, and buying our treasuries and using the yuan as try to get that to become an international reserve currency. But let's take a step back and try to figure out why this behavior is part of Chinese culture. They analyze us. They understand that the United States is a consumer culture and that 70% of our economy is for consumer goods, and that we love cheap goods, and that Walmart has replaced a lot of small businesses. So they know that if they can increase exports by manipulating currency, they can get their goods into the Home Depots, the Lowe's, the Walmarts, the Costco's, and that the United States wage growth, remember, has not grown over the last 20 years. So Americans need to have those cheap Chinese goods flowing in. And so we almost require the Chinese to manipulate the currency so we get cheaper goods. We like that. And the Chinese have analyzed our needs and wants and said, this is how we can get them back. We can make them entrapped into buying our goods because they're cheaper. And so that is what has become very frustrating dealing with them on trade. And they don't budge on these trade policies. And they choose winners and losers. And most of the time they choose winners. So they'll pick an industry that they want to upend, and they will subsidize it and support it until it's a champion, whether it's steel or whether it's consumer electronics, you name it. They will find a way to make sure various sectors of their economy are champions of that economy.
Right. But if you have no resistance to that, then we're just letting them do it. I don't understand why we're letting them do it. That's what I don't get. Prior to Trump, Obama didn't do anything. Bush didn't do anything. I just don't understand why we don't fight back against their unfair practices.
And we were ignoring the manufacturing jobs that were leaving the United States. It seemed like the business lobby, the Chamber of Commerce and other types of associations for business were willing to fight a little bit harder to allow politicians in the United States to look the other way when they took factories and moved them to China. Even though it's difficult because China is so far ahead of us in the time change, and there's the cultural changes, and then there's differences in, of course, our language and the way it's very difficult to interpret and translate the Chinese language.
But if you offshore production to China, if you're a GE or some company like that, you have to basically give up your intellectual property. You have to build research and development centers. There's a high cost associated with offshoring to China. It's very short-sighted. I think it's a lose at the end. I get that they're saving on labor. Like I said, I think it's short-sighted, and it's not going to be pretty at the end for them.
It's short-sighted because our American corporate system, especially when it's publicly traded, is short-sighted because they have to show quarterly growth and sales growth and earnings growth and revenue growth because of their stock price. So our corporate strategy is shorter sighted than the Chinese strategy. Remember, China thinks long term, we think short term.
We think about the next quarter's quarterly results. Right?
So cut costs by outshoring units of production in China to make more money every quarter.
We think in terms of quarterly profits, and they think in terms of centuries.
Correct.
So let me just to help us understand why our trade deficit with China is such a big deal. On previous episodes, we talked about the aggregate demand curve. So the total output in the economy is dominated by four factors: consumption, business investment, government spending, and net exports, right?
Yes.
So net exports, imports minus exports. Because we have a trade deficit, our net exports are small. Whereas China's, it's the negative of that. So their trade deficit with the United States is positive. And so we contribute to their economy and they reduce our economic output. So just to put that into perspective, in his book, Death by China, Peter Navarro says, quote, "A predatory China has stolen millions of American manufacturing jobs right from under our noses. If we had held on to those jobs, America's unemployment rate would be well below 5%. The U.S. government budget would be in balance, and our once fairer country would be facing a far brighter future than any we can currently envision. The obvious question is this: why have we as a nation stood so passively by in the face of one of the greatest heists in global economic history? China's theft of American manufacturing base."
That is very frustrating. And it goes back to long-term strategy that the Chinese are playing on us. We assume that these hawks that want to replace the United States and make China the world hegemon, we assume they're weak. The Ying Pai, which I talked about earlier, the Chinese hawks, they are closely advising the Chinese political leadership. And a lot of this is about economics too, not just military. The Chinese believe in diplomacy, intelligence, military, and economics, and all of these levers of power they use. We don't do that. We kind of focus on one thing at a time. We don't catch all of these types of strategy portrayals in the United States government. We don't do it that way. And these hawks are telling the Chinese leaders to deceive and manipulate Americans, get their intelligence, steal their technology, connive Americans, get more assistance for the military, technology, and economy. And this is what happened in the 1970s, and they built on that. But they want China to replace the United States as the number one world power by 2049. That's 100 years since China's revolution in 1949. And that's the 100-year marathon that Michael Pillsbury talks about. So they're willing to play the long game for decades. And then the hawks deny that's what they want. But that is their real intent.
A long march.
Yeah, and the long march is part of the peaceful rise, that there is going to be peace, that they do not want to be a global hegemon, or even a regional hegemon. They want to return China to the level of power they enjoyed 300 years ago, though, when their economy was a third of the total world economy.
But they colonized Latin America and Africa. So how do you reconcile the peaceful rise with their colonialism?
That's interesting, too. They accuse us of being imperialist and makers of colonies, and they're doing the same thing. But the Chinese diplomats deny they want to be global leaders, and I think that's the big one. And as a result, many American policymakers and diplomats were what were called panda huggers, pro-Chinese in the 1970s and the 1980s. They wanted to promote peaceful relations. It was all about diplomacy. We misunderstood that the inroads that Nixon and Kissinger were making were going to create a nice diplomatic relationship that they took advantage of in the 70s and the 80s. We wanted to promote peaceful relations so it would result in government reforms and that the country would become more democratic. And this created a blind spot that China was not a threat, but China was actually using everything it could to advance its interests without alarming the international community. We were tricked by them.
So the reason why I think our government prior to Trump and after Trump isn't doing anything about China is because it empowers the elites. It's bad for the working class. It goes back to the rise of the administrative state and the managerial elite in episode, I believe that was 5. It's part of the growing inequality in American life where elites get richer while the working class suffers. So it goes back into that class war.
And a lot of people didn't really understand. They knew that the jobs were going overseas, but they didn't realize what China was doing behind the scenes for reasons that you were talking about earlier, like manipulating currencies. It's difficult for the American people to understand China. China has always been kind of a black box. It's very far away. American people focus on different types of crises they have to deal with, such as the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. The Chinese were smart enough to just stimulate their way out of that crisis. It touched them, but not as bad as the United States and Europe. So the financial crisis was a time where the Chinese were like, yep, we told you, see, United States is declining. We're rising in power. We did not cause the global financial crisis. We came out of it okay. And so this was a change of diplomatic thinking, that the diplomats in China could come into the United States and really teach us a lesson. And I have professional diplomatic experience with the Chinese government and other diplomats from Chinese embassies. When I worked for a certain governor when I lived in New Mexico, and I was in charge of international relations and diplomacy for this governor. And what happens a lot when you get new political leaders in the United States, other countries want to find out more about them. So they set up these meetings and they're really trying to gather political intelligence. So I met with a group of 10 Chinese diplomats. It was me against 10 of them. And they rolled really deep and they tried to roll me and intimidate me and tell me that our system was weaker. I mean, this was something I never experienced before in diplomacy. It's usually not the way diplomacy works, but the Chinese were very full of themselves. They saw that we were weak and they looked at ways that diplomacy could overwhelm the United States. So people like me were just bum rushed.
They view us as weak and stupid.
And not willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. They look at us as being very selfish and individualistic.
Selfish, fat. That's sort of the Soviet. I mean, all communists view Americans that way. You guys are fat. You're stupid.
You're on drugs.
You're selfish. You don't care about the greater good. That's the view of capitalists. They're selfish. They're in it to enrich themselves. They don't care about the larger community, if you will.
So this head diplomat, he was coming from the San Francisco embassy that China had in the United States. He told me that America was suffering and China had a better economy. He's very haughty, very overconfident. All right, he left. I chalked it up to a learning experience. I should have been a little more prepared to fend off some of these attacks, but I wasn't. I was kind of bamboozled by the whole thing. Well, after that meeting, the FBI got a hold of me and they said, can you share with us details about that certain diplomat and the way that he conducted diplomatic affairs? And I told I used diplomatic speak with the FBI, but I said, this was very unorthodox. This is not the way that two countries get along, and that the Chinese were extremely confident. They were haughty. They were looking at ways to kind of make fun of us and kick us while we were down. And I passed that along to the FBI. The FBI never questioned me again. But isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That the FBI were worried about this diplomat and the way he conducted business too.
Yeah, let's talk about Chinese spies. They're everywhere. You got students, you have visitors. Obviously, not everybody is a Chinese spy, but even if there's 5% of them, that's a huge number of people that steal our intellectual property, that steal our secrets, our trade secrets. And so if I was running a country, I would probably ban Chinese students from coming to American college, or at least limit them, or at least have more scrutiny.
They've given so much money to different.
And it goes back to the managerial elites. The elites are so spoiled on Chinese money. They're drunk on Chinese money. And that has blinded them to the fact that we are in a war. China is our enemy. China isn't our friend.
They use academia a lot, and then they have these Confucius institutes that are basically little propaganda centers on campus. And a lot of universities and colleges like Chinese students because they pay full tuition. When I teach in Washington, D.C., George Washington University, George Mason, American University. I've taught at all those universities. And when I teach international security, I have to be very careful because the students are reporting back and I have to watch what I say. So I make sure that I don't give away any of our best, not really secrets, but kind of our military strategy and tactics and techniques and procedures that I know being a former Army officer. So I make sure that everything I talk about when there are Chinese nationalists in my class is not classified, that is public domain, and that they would not get any advantages if they took what I said and took it back to China.
Right. And I'm being in computer science and mathematics in STEM fields, a huge percentage of my classmates were international students from China.
And they were going to take that knowledge and their degrees and go back and
compete against us.
Yeah.
And destroy us. Let me go back to net exports and try to quantify how our trade deficit has negatively affected our economy. Here's a critical observation that underscores the essential role that net exports play in our economy. When America runs a chronic trade deficit with China, this shaves critical points off of our economic growth rate. This slower growth rate, in turn, thereby reduces the number of jobs America creates. Of course, as the American economy suffers from slow growth rate and high unemployment, China enjoys just the opposite effect. The dragon booms while America goes bust. Our trade deficit with China has typically shaved off close to half a point of GDP growth a year. While that might not seem like a huge sum, it translates into a cumulative impact of millions of jobs that the American economy failed to create.
This is all part of a greater strategy. Once again, the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, now believes in the China dream or the strong nation dream. So it's a little bit different than the peaceful rise. This means that by 2049, as I said before, China becomes the number one world power. That's what they think. And they're going to win this marathon with their superior civilization and culture and go back to where they were in the early times of the warring civilization, where they were one of the number one civilizations in the world. And then they will spread their culture to other states. And so that's scary too. But they have a long-term strategy that they've developed over centuries, that they've learned from the history of the Warring States period. And they induce complacency to avoid alerting the opponent, and they hide in plain sight. They wait to strike when the U.S. is weakest. And so that's what they do. And all of this can be explained by this strategy and the way they view economics and trade.
Brent, I don't know about you, but I don't want to live under a Chinese hegemony. I shudder to think what a world would look like under Chinese domination.
One thing that we've been good at, and this was because of the rise of Trump, we now realize that China is a threat. It used to be it wasn't top of mind. Now, if you talk to people, they understand that we have to be alerted to China. So part of this is education. They're hiding in plain sight. No, now they're out in the open. And they want to strike the U.S. when it's weakest. Now we know. They want to manipulate our advisors. Now we know. They want to keep doing diplomacy the way I talked about. Now the FBI knows because I told them. So they are ready to be patient for even decades to achieve this victory. But now that we know, we have to start fashioning our own strategy that balances against China.
They want to destroy us economically. They're pulling on us what we pulled on the Soviet Union.
Well, that's partially true. I would say China is much more aggressive than what we were. But to win the Cold War, we did focus on diplomacy, economics, trade, espionage, fighting covert wars around the globe against communism, building up our military. They're building up their military too. I'll talk about that later. But they're willing to steal our ideas and our technology for strategic purposes. They're willing to get into espionage to help their economy. They're willing to do cyber-espionage. They stole plans for our F-22 and our F-35. They have fighters that look almost exactly like those fighters, and they did this with their intelligence agencies. And they also look at people who have immigrated, Chinese immigrants to the United States, and say, hey, you're really loyal to China.
Yeah.
And so, you're doing espionage to create advantages of what you can find in the United States and transfer that to China.
Or if Chinese immigrants have family members back home, they hold them as hostages.
Yeah, and that's recognizing that the United States is weak and that you can do extreme actions and that the United States will make mistakes and China will not make mistakes.
They laugh at us.
Yeah, so always be vigilant about this. The Chinese are vigilant. They want to avoid being encircled by U.S. allies. I think the best thing that we can do to balance against China is to create more alliances and help the alliances that we already have. So alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Singapore, Australia, Taiwan, of course, the big one there, and other countries that want to side with the United States. The Chinese hate that. They do not want to be encircled by a system of alliances. So the more that we do military exchanges, that we sell arms, especially to Vietnam and Japan and Taiwan, they hate that. So I think if we do more of that, they hate the idea of being encircled by our allies, by the United States. So if we can be vigilant and support our allies economically with trade relationships and not trade as much with China, trade with our allies, I think that's a way that we can balance back against and push back against the Chinese.
So going back to currency manipulation, just how does China manipulate its currency? It does so by effectively hard pegging its yuan to the dollar at a grossly undervalued fixed exchange rate. This ultra cheap yuan, in turn, provides a lucrative subsidy for Chinese exporters while levying a hefty tax on U.S. exports to China. The result of this currency manipulation, working in league with other Chinese unfair trade practices we have discussed, has been the chronic U.S. trade deficits we have just weighted and measured. Now, here's the key currency manipulation point. America's trade imbalance with China could never persist in a world of free trade, where China allowed its currency to float freely alongside other floating currencies around the world, like the euro, the Japanese yen, Swiss franc, Brazilian real, Indian rupee, and the US dollar. In a world of free trade, characterized by completely floating exchange rate, the US-China trade imbalance would never persist because as the US trade deficit rose, the dollar would fall relative to the yuan. As the dollar fell, US exports to China would rise. Chinese imports would fall and trade would come into balance. However, by pegging the yuan to the dollar, a mercantilist China subverts this free trade adjustment process, even as it undermines a global free trade framework based on the promise of mutual gain.
We were again overconfident, asleep at the wheel, naive, not realizing that they were going to rise. Now, we dealt with this. Japan in the 1980s was using trade policy and some of the certain types of helping out, subsidizing certain types of industries, especially the auto industry, to beat us. But Japan got into a demographic problem where they have an aging society and they spend too much government money and they had deflation. And so Japan kind of faded as a world power, but China has not. They're not going to make some of that same mistakes. Now, one thing we should say about China, they do have weaknesses. One is that they have demographic problems. They had the one-child policy for a long time, and they're gradually growing older. So in the 90s and the aughts, they were in a demographic sweet spot to really produce a lot of different types of goods and services. Those people are growing older. Their health is suffering, and they are making more demands on the state that the state does not have resources to help them. There's not a social security system or retirement system. So children are expected to take care of their elders. So more people are aging in China. They have a demographic problem, and their economy is not growing like it used to be. And they're having problems with real estate. People are refusing to pay their mortgages. Right now in China, in the United States, if you build a house, you don't start paying on the house until it's built and you move in. That's not the way it is in China. In China, as soon as they sell you a house, you start paying on it, even if they haven't built the apartment yet. Most Chinese live in apartments or condos. And so people are refusing to pay their mortgages. And so you're seeing a lot of pressures that the Chinese government is really worried. They're worried about Hong Kong. They're worried about Taiwan because they saw what happened to the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union disintegrated. It was a communist party that was decadent and corrupt and was not providing goods and services for their country. And so the communism fell in the Soviet Union. The Chinese are very scared of that happening to them. So China learned that communism could fail and that governments could be overthrown. So China is extremely scared that their communism could end someday.
Yes, that's their fear. They want to maintain power. That's the only objective that they have. It's not to help their people. It's to maintain their totalitarian hold on the country and to dominate the world and to export that totalitarianism across the world.
They know they have to create jobs in the cities, especially on the East Coast, because they know that if people do not have jobs, they're more likely to protest. And so they're always worrying about having at least 8 to 9% GDP growth a year. They're not getting that. They're around 2% to 3%. And we all know they had trouble during COVID by locking down the economy. And so they created a lot of supply chain problems for the rest of the world.
Yep. And China is also buying up our debt.
They do that. The treasuries that they buy and they hold on to is a way to form a wedge between China and the United States. They could always sell the treasuries. I think Japan owns a little bit more of American debt, but they supply.
I think China's number one now.
China's number one of the foreign. Yeah, it's probably really close to Japan and China, but you have to worry about a country that is our strategic rival holding our debt.
That undermines American sovereignty.
Of course. And they know that. And so that's one way that they can make sure that their strategy for.
And it uses that leverage over us to threaten us.
That's right. It's, the sword of Damocles holding the sword over our heads, knowing that China could, during the 100-year marathon, sell their holdings in treasuries and really mess up the exchange rate, really manipulate the currency.
The Chinese government has begun a concerted campaign of economic threats against the United States, hinting that it may liquidate its vast holding of U.S. treasuries if Washington imposes trade sanctions. Described as China's nuclear option, such action could trigger a dollar crash. It would also cause a spike in U.S. bond yields, hammering the U.S. housing market and perhaps tipping the economy into a recession. It's bad enough that Chinese currency manipulation has left the American economy stuck in first gear while destroying millions of jobs. It also undermines American political sovereignty. At the heart of this matter is what the war hawks running China's central bank have threatened us with. These hawks call it the financial nuclear option, and it involves using China's vast foreign reserves to destabilize America's banks, stock market, and bond market. To understand just how credible China's threat of dropping the big one on America's financial system is, it helps to illustrate more precisely how China manipulates its currency. This process begins when you and I walk into a store like Walmart and buy a Chinese product, after which our dollars are shipped overseas. At this point, to maintain the US dollar's fixed peg to the yuan, China must promptly recycle our Walmart dollars back into the United States by buying financial assets such as U.S. government bonds, U.S. real estate, or U.S. companies. Otherwise, upward pressures would build on the yuan. Now, here's perhaps the most interesting little twist on this currency manipulation tale. Before the Chinese government can recycle any of our Walmart dollars, it must gain control of those dollars from the Chinese exporters that accumulated them. This requires a convoluted process known as sterilization. To sterilize our Walmart dollars, the Chinese government forces its exporters to buy Chinese government bonds denominated in US dollars. In return for surrendering their greenbacks, exporters then receive 4% interest on the sterilization bonds. The Chinese government then turns around and reinvests the captured, sterilized greenbacks back into U.S. government bonds that pay less than 2% interest. China thereby loses 2% or more in interest on every dollar it sterilizes, and the losses run into the billions. Here's the important part. Just why is the Chinese central bank willing to shoulder such huge losses? It is because the Communist Party is far more interested in creating jobs to maintain political stability and its totalitarian grip on the country than it is in actually making money. That's one of the big differences between true American capitalism and China's perverted beggar thy neighbor brand of state capitalism. And never mind that in this zero-sum currency manipulation process, many of the jobs that China gains are exactly the ones lost by the American economy. In fact, this process of Chinese currency manipulation has led to accumulation of over $2 trillion in U.S. foreign reserves. The number is much bigger now held by the People's Bank of China, aka America's mortgage banker. It is precisely China's massive accumulation of dollar-denominated foreign reserves that now allows the Chinese Communist Party to credibly threaten to nuke our financial system. If China were to begin dumping dollars, this would lead to a massive depreciation of the dollar. In fact, there's clear evidence that a kowtowing Uncle Sam has already begun to surrender at least some of America's political sovereignty to China because of the credibility of China's financial nuclear option. Indeed, any time now that the White House, the Congress, or U.S. trade representative threatens to crack down on unfair trade practices, China fires a missile across our bow by threatening to dump, and in some cases actually dumping, U.S. dollar reserves. Indeed, the existence of this financial nuclear option goes a long way toward explaining the perennially timid behavior toward China of various U.S. secretaries of treasuries over the last decade, from Bush's Hank Paulson to Obama's Timothy Geithner. And please understand this. Over time, it would be extremely naive for any American to think that China's greenback blackmail will be limited to merely trade issues. At some point, Chinese officials are likely to use this weapon on any one of a number of geopolitical issues, from White House visits by the Dalai Lama and arms sales to India to the ever-present conflicts on the Korean Peninsula and the ever-touchy U.S. backing of Taiwan. So I know this was long-winded, but I think it was important to fully understand how China is in control of America's sovereignty.
They're willing to fight an economic war, a financial war, a trade war against us and keep that as part of their strategy. And you talked about firing missiles across the bow. Let's talk a little bit about the military because we're over an hour and we don't want to take up too much of your time. But there is a question about the strength of China's military. It's come a long way in the last 20 years since when I first started studying the Chinese military in 2003. I had just gotten back from Korea and I was trying to become a Northeast Asia expert. And then after 9/11, that all changed. Everybody became Middle East experts. But I was trying to keep an eye on China and the military since then, since about 2003. And they have become much stronger. There's 3 aircraft carriers now. The Chinese used to be afraid to fly at night, afraid to fly in bad weather. They have better fighters. They stole our designs from the F-35, the F-22. They have a stealthy kind of a fighter, not fully stealthy, but it does have stealth characteristics. They have 3 aircraft carriers. They can do carrier operations. They have the biggest navy in the world, the most ships, so they can form carrier battle groups and they can menace their region. They don't have a true blue water navy, but they have a regional navy that's very strong. They're working on a 4th aircraft carrier. They have nuclear weapons. Their ballistic missile program is extremely strong. They have hundreds upon hundreds of missiles pointed at Taiwan. What could they do to the Taiwanese? They could do many things. They fly on a daily, weekly basis into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. They fly close to Taiwan. They fly different types of bombers, fighters, and command and control aircraft. And so they do that. They showed already this summer that they could pose a problem with forming a blockade. They have enough ships to do a blockade. I think if things got really bad in terms of Taiwan wanting its own independence, that they could show again that they could do a blockade and stifle Taiwan. I think that's the most likely scenario. Another scenario would be an amphibious warfare invasion to Taiwan. They have the ships to do that. They have the naval infantry or Marines, the Chinese do. They could do a blitzkrieg attack with their missiles and just totally saturate Taiwan with a shock and awe bombing situation from their bombers and also from their ballistic missiles. So Taiwan is really worried about the strength of the Chinese military. If you look at the Chinese military spending in the last 20 years, it is a rising, upwardly sloping line. Taiwan has stayed about the same with their defense spending. We want them to spend more, way more than their 2% of GDP, which they're trying to spend more, but China has gone way above that. And so you look at nuclear weapons, you look at ballistic missiles, you look at the Navy growing, largest Navy in the world, you look at the Air Force growing, it's a 1 million-man army. So China and Taiwan could come into conflict. And I think the most likely scenario would be a blockade by the Navy. I don't think there would be an attack. Now, having said all that, do we totally worry about the Chinese military? Yes, we should worry. But remember, they haven't fought a war since 1979. And that was like a 3 or 4 week little invasion with Vietnam, a small war. So all of their pilots, all of their ship drivers, and all of their military people had had no combat experience. The United States has a lot of combat experience. We've been, busy since 9/11. And so all of our fighter pilots are much better flyers, I would say. Our carrier operations are much better. And then the Chinese have some weaknesses with their demographics, as I said before. So they are probably not going to move fast against Taiwan. They are risk averse. They're not like the Russians. Putin is a gambler and willing to take risks. Xi Jinping is not. He kind of wants to bide his time, but they are willing to show their strength against Taiwan. And if the United States interferes in any way, they are more likely to take a next step, and I think that would be a blockade.
So just to close the economic loop, because I think this is important, China is buying our debt. China helps us finance our programs and the Federal Reserve's easy money printing press.
Well, the Chinese love that we're getting an inflationary period, right?
It is largely because of America's blood-sucking trade deficits with China that America's politicians feel they need to keep priming the economic pump with deficit spending, even as we keep getting deeper and deeper into debt to a totalitarian regime benefiting greatly from our demise. You keep buying our debt, you keep buying our bonds, China, and we won't take any meaningful actions on trade reform. In this way, our elites put politics and short-term financial needs ahead of America's prospects for long-term economic recovery. This is dead wrong, because no matter how many trillions of Walmart dollars we borrow back from China to throw at the American economy, these stimulus bucks won't make any difference until we achieve constructive currency reform with China.
And China plays the long game. Remember this strategy. It's a long 100-year marathon to 2049. There are people in the United States that know about this 2049 year. It's huge. There's a think tank called the 2049 Institute to make sure that we are making sure we keep an eye on China. And they're worried that communism could fail and the government could be overthrown. So they're extremely scared that their communism could end someday. And so that drives a lot of this.
Correct.
So they're going to do a stronger rise than the peaceful rise that they've done over the years.
And the irony is currency reform if the yuan were more competitive relative to the dollar, it would actually benefit Chinese consumers.
That's true. I haven't thought about that. That's a way that they could help their people become. But remember,
a stronger yuan would put significantly more purchasing power in the hands of woefully underdeveloped Chinese consumer. In this way, Chinese currency reform would make China far less dependent on selling exports to the rest of the world, a vulnerability that represents the true Achilles heel of China's growth model.
that was one of the assumptions that we had economically about China, is that their consumer class would grow. They're more savers. They have to save for their parents' retirement. They have to save for their own retirement. So there is a consumer culture. They love, the wealthy Chinese, they love labels and brands, and they love to buy. They love to come over here and go to outlet malls.
Right.
They love outlet malls. But we have assumed that the Chinese consumer would have grown more and wanted more American products and goods and services. That hasn't happened as much as we thought with these types of trade policy.
Let me ask you this question, Brent. Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese imports to the United States. I guess he wasn't worried about their so-called nuclear option, driving down the U.S. dollar. Did he take a risk, unnecessary risk, by doing that? I'm trying to understand kind of the Trump strategy when he was in office.
It was more protectionism and protect different, especially the steel industry and other industries that have been hurt so much over the years. And I think it was a message to the world that the United States was not going to put up with this anymore. So I think it was really strong. And then you compare the presidency of Joe Biden. He never talks about China. He never talks about the China threat.
Right.
He never talks about the jobs lost and the intellectual property lost and the pirating of goods and all the things that we've talked about in this podcast.
And the other thing we should talk about, they also want to dominate space.
Oh, sure. They have a lunar program. They have probes going into
And control the satellites in space.
Yeah, they're responsible for a lot of space junk that's out there and debris. But their space program is growing, and we have to keep an eye on that.
So, given that China holds a lot of our debt, how do we disentangle from China going forward?
I think it's very difficult for our economies to decouple. I think there was a point where we could have 20 years ago. I think that it's very difficult for us to disengage just because of the way the American consumer is addicted to Chinese goods and services that are at your dollar store, that are at your Five and Below store, that are at your Walmarts.
Right.
And I think with the consumer being such a really important part of the U.S. economy, we're addicted to those cheap goods, and the Chinese know it. And so we have to be more protective of our own industries. We have to do things that we can build American business and buy American goods and services first. And it's very difficult because they're often more expensive, but I think that's something that you can do. I'm addicted to, cheap electronics. I like my smart fitness watch that was probably made in China. That was only $50. My cordless headphones are only $50. So I like cheap goods too. But there has to be a way that we can, and we have some great companies. We have SpaceX and Tesla and Apple and many others. That are going.
It starts with bringing back manufacturing.
That advanced manufacturing. Now, keep in mind, a lot of manufacturing is done by robots. But yeah, we have to bring back some of these jobs. And you're seeing some reshoring, especially Trump. When he became president, there was a lot of companies that are investing in the United States coming back from China because they found out that you have better relations with the United States government. And you can find out that dealing with the Chinese government, where they steal your intellectual property, we have to give them some of the technology and bring back those jobs. I think you're finding more of that.
In short, China would rather destroy us than help itself.
It's going to be a competitive rise for the next coming decades. Remember that year, 2049. That's the 100-year marathon that these hardliners and the hawks really want to make sure that they're advising Xi Jinping, and he's becoming more of a hardliner, and he's cracking down. They have the social credit scores,
right,
where they make sure that you play nice. If you do bad things, that your score falls and goes lower, and that you're not going to get a loan, you're not going to get to travel, you're not going to get a job.
You can't go to the university.
Yeah, there's all these totalitarian ways that they keep an eye on their public. We assume that they would be more democratic by now. That's not going to happen.
Right.
We assume the military would not grow as much. That's not going to happen. We assume that they would have a peaceful rise. It's a much more hegemonic rise. So we have to be alerted to this. We have to be educated, and we have to use our allies to make sure that China doesn't dominate its own neighborhood.
It's a shame that the Democrats perpetuated this Russia hoax. It diverted attention from the real enemy, which is China.
That's a really interesting point. Now,
to me, when they did that, not only did they undermine a duly elected president, but they took America's attention away from the real enemy that we need to be focused on, which is China. And in my view, it's unforgivable, treasonous even.
Could be. I'm a Russia expert, and I was more alarmist about the Russians simply because they're a nuclear power.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to them.
They have natural resources. But
relatively speaking, which is a bigger threat, China or Russia?
I think Russia is more willing to take risks, and that's the scary part. They're
risks?
By invading Ukraine. I mean, that was a risky thing, but they're willing to do dangerous things. The Chinese are willing to stay back and wait.
Do you think they'll take Taiwan before Joe Biden leaves office?
No, I don't think that. I don't think the Chinese they're going to keep status quo, but they're going to make sure that they are always in the upper hand position. And by that, they're going to keep flying patrols close. They're going to keep their carriers very close. They're going to make sure that they build up their Navy and that they have the largest Navy in the world coming in the other decades, and that they can intimidate Taiwan. But I don't think Xi Jinping is going to do the Taiwan invasion yet. I don't see that happening.
Well, why not?
Because that's not in Chinese strategic culture. Their strategic culture is more slow.
They would rather control it than invade it, box it in. That's a leverage that they can play geopolitically. If you don't do X, we will invade Taiwan. They can play this threat card
for a long time. Yeah.
Right.
But you still have these people, the elites in China, namely their generals and admirals that are hardliners that do say it's time to go after
China hawks.
Going after China. So they have a lot of influence in China. Well, just summing up, they are playing a difficult game that we are not used to in the West. It's a different strategic culture. It is a long game. It is 2049. It is a 100-year marathon. And you have to really worry about some of these things and make sure that you're vigilant. Make sure that the United States supports its allies and forms new alliances to balance against China. This is a situation that the United States government is going to have to build up its military even more, spend more money. We're looking at getting close to $1 trillion defense budget. We spend about over $800 billion a year on our defense. And if we're going to deal with Russia and Ukraine and China at the same time, not to mention North Korea, not to mention Iran, not to mention terrorism in Africa and the Middle East, we are going to have to figure out a strategy where we can keep China at bay and make sure we prepare for other threats that threaten the United States.
China is a real threat. Tucker had a segment on a couple of weeks ago where the guest said that we would not win a war with China.
Well, it would be a bloodbath, and I think it would be quick, and I think that we would
quick for whom?
I think for both sides. I don't think it would last a long time. I think the ships would use standoff missiles, and I think our ships qualitatively are better than theirs, even though they have a quantitative advantage. And I think our standoff missiles and our ballistic missile defense by our Navy and our individual pilots are better than their individual pilots, and that we could send more carrier groups in there. And so I think that, I've talked to United States Navy officers that have served in the Indo-Pacific, and they say, we're going to roll them up. If they try anything, we're going to send our missiles to their ships. They have carrier-killing missiles, true. But again, the Chinese have not been in a war, so they're not completely confident about their military yet, but that could change.
Navarro makes the point in his book that we won World War II not because our weapons were superior to the Nazis. We won World War II because we were the world's factory. We were a more productive nation, and now China is the more productive nation. So even though our weapons are technically, I guess, more superior than China, they have a lot more of them.
Quantitatively. And the other problem with our military strategy is that we don't have a one vision. During the Cold War, we had a vision of containment and going after the Soviet Union. We don't have that now. We don't have champions of national security. We don't have Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ to a certain extent that
are you saying
not
Mark
worried.
Milley isn't Eisenhower?
Yeah, we need somebody to be the national champion for international security, and we don't have that right now. China sees that. China knows that.
Are you saying that reading about white rage isn't as important as developing new weapons?
We do not have our eye on the ball. We need to get focused and get away from this woke military concepts and focus on the threats that are coming at us in the next several decades.
Does the Chinese military worry about wokeness?
Of course not. They don't have to think about that at all. They don't have any politically correct.
They call us baizu, Chinese word for wokeness.
Right.
Baizu, which I guess the literal translation is woke, white, liberal.
They want us domestically to tear each other apart. They love this polarization, and they love that we can't get anything done in Washington. And so they're going to bankrupt us too. They're seeing our government is spending all kinds of money, and they love that. They make it because the less money that can be spent on the United States military.
They would rather see us divided than focus on them.
Of course. Well, we hope that you have heard something that you like. Maybe spend some time educating yourself, analyze these situations, understand economics and finance and trade and the military balance and United States allies in the Far East. Be vigilant, alert people, try to buy American as much as you can. Try to stand up against socialism and communism. Always call them the Chinese communists. That's one thing Rush Limbaugh always called them, Chinese communists. Over and over, these are communists. And make sure that you're standing up against socialism and communism in the United States too.
Call a spade a spade.
Yes, you can do that. Well, that gets us to about an hour and a half, folks. We went kind of long on this one, but it's a fascinating topic. There's lots to talk about. Think about Chinese strategy. It's slower, it's longer, and they think more about these things.
Yeah. While we're focused on next quarter's earnings, they're focused on the long march and global domination and becoming the world's superpower by 2049, if not sooner.
While we focus on federal elections every 2 years, and we have different presidents coming in and out, they are focused on one leader, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, and the Communist Party as a hegemon. Okay, well, thank you for this listening, and we look forward to our next podcast next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Truth Caviar Show. Email us at truthcaviarshow@gmail.com and let us know what you think about the show. And remember, no bias, no bull, no fear, just hard truths.